I'm going to try and go through this pretty quickly for you. It's primarily a summary, since all of you should have had the copies of the report itself. The report is in two particular formats. One is a summary, because the topics themselves are very inclusive of information. They take up a lot of room. So we decided that we would make them an appendix to the report. And so what I will do is give you a summary of the summary, in essence. And I think the first thing I'll note here is that one of the first things we did was indeed change the name of the group to the Water Resources Technical Group, and I'll explain the fact of why that was done. It was because the experts are, in fact, quite, members and experts are quite technically oriented, and wanted to make sure that the report was, in fact, based on data and science. So this is the technical group itself, the members. There are 11 active members. It turns out that Jamestown, in their wisdom and in appreciation of their professionalism, decided that they would vote as a team. So there are 9 votes, if you would, but 11 representatives who participated in filling out the entire report. What I want to point out, because I think most of you will know just about everybody on the team, but what's very important, and was important for me, was the representation of the agencies. You know, we had pretty much everybody that we needed in terms of government agencies, the Jamestown Tribe, Joe Holtrop from Clown Conservation District. We had Tom Martin representing basically our infrastructure in the peninsula for water resources, Grays Marsh, City of Sequim, and Lance Vale as a hydrologist. So we had quite a few, representation was pretty broad, and that was good because we had most of the interests that we needed to be concerned with representative on the committee. We had 6 advisory members, and those members are shown here. And the way we worked was the team worked diligently on getting the topics identified, getting the formats and the information content set up. When we finally had agreement, wide-ranging agreement, at that point, we decided to submit the report to the scientific advisory members and basically open it up, and we solicited from them any comments, not just, you know, maybe corrections, but if we were heading in the wrong direction, if they had something to add that we had neglected, we asked for all that information. We did get a good response and very helpful information, and we amended everything that you'll see in the report to reflect the inputs from the advisory members. So these are the folks, and basically all of them did contribute to specific topics, not all the topics. As far as the group itself, our mission statement is pretty broad, and that was good. It didn't have restrictions in it that would keep us from doing or looking at something that we thought was important. But I think the key words is the fact that we were asked to offer recommendations, not to get specific in terms of how or when something was to be done. And also the other key word was updating the management tools, because one of the conclusions at the end of this exercise was that there was a lot of good work been done, a lot of good people, a hell of a lot of work. As a matter of fact, if you look at the references, you might be surprised to find out how much work has been done, but unfortunately they're dated. And the area of that's significant is the fact that in terms of climate change, dated information is of diminished value. And so that was important that the updating was a consideration. The executive committee did ask that we focus on central data and information. And related to that was what studies would still be needed. I think we've covered that. And also what management tools could be updated or needed that don't exist, that in view of climate change, we should consider. Whoops, excuse me. The spatial domain, I wanted to consider this and show you this. You'll see within the report itself, you might find that we do refer to the DRMT geographic focus area or the Dungeness Watershed or even WRTG, the Water Resource Inventory Area. And that's because a lot of the documentation, a lot of the studies and the efforts all were concentrated with specific notations, and any of the references to geographic area or spatial domain basically cover the area that you're looking at, which is essentially WR18. It covers all the waters, stream flow, groundwater, all the conditions we could get in terms of precipitation from rainfall to snowpack. And one of the other key areas that we wanted to make sure we didn't neglect was the impact on fish and wildlife. Certainly the salmon being critical, or all fish of that nature being critical, but also in general, were there impacts coming that we should consider in general on all wildlife. The scope in terms of time domain, a little bit different. Again, the opening slide, I remember Ron Allen at the Earth Day celebration, I think he captured the essence of the entire day in 4 words: climate change is real. That's all he had to say. And as a consequence, we decided we would focus on 5 years. That didn't mean we neglected longer term views. If something would take longer, or there was an impact that needed to be considered, or if there was a study that should be longer in time domain extent because you're paying for it, you might as well get it done. That was fine, but our primary focus was on a shorter time domain. And one of the things we also considered, but it really needs to be considered in going forward, we did not restrict our topics, our recommendations, or any of our reviews to be limited by resources, either agency resources or funding, for instance. We wanted to have them stand alone on their own merit, knowing that the implementation of anything going forward would require that the responsible agency determinations be made. Is it SQUIM? Is it the county? Is it PUD? Is it beyond that? And we needed to bring in outside agencies. And we want to recognize that even if somebody were to step out and want to take care of some of these recommendations and implement some of these studies, there's a time delay. Planning, then assignment of people, and most importantly, probably is funding. Anything going forward is going to require a source of revenue. So while we, like I say, pick the topics and the recommendations, these are the considerations going forward that are going to have to be looked at. Contracting for sure. And then once you had these topics underway, if you were to take them all 13 or any subset of the 13, you're going to need to gather a lot of data and perform a lot of analysis on that data before you can generally respond to the issue itself. And, you know, here our water resources are very dependent on an annual cycle. So having these studies and efforts underway for a year or more is probably essential. Now, one of the things I also want to clarify for you, a little bit of the background, is how did we go about accomplishing this report? And basically, our first meeting was refined to resolution of these. And the ground rules, one of the most essential ones, was that recommendations were to be based on factual data or scientific analysis studies. And what this basically says is anecdotal information is fine for comments, for consideration, but that anything the committee was backing, anything the committee wanted to put in writing and put down as a factual basis had to have either data, of which there is an awful lot, not necessarily accumulated, not necessarily easy to access, but there is a lot of data here, and there's a lot of studies. Second thing is we wanted to avoid any efforts in terms of recommendations and what have you that included policy recommendations. It was not within our scope to do anything more than approach these issues as standalone pipes, if you would, and it's up to policymakers to make recommendations and to move forward. Another key issue was certainly the DRMT operates on a consensus basis, certainly seeking consensus, and we wanted to do the same thing. We wanted to have something that everybody could stand behind, representing all the agencies, but we also knew that we had a time limit, and we did not want to be constrained if we did not want to get hung up where a debate or a serious issue was based on particular agency desires or consensus or lack of consensus. And so we decided that a majority vote would prevail. And as I said earlier, we had 11 members, voting members, so 5 votes would be the basis. And I'm happy to say, for the most part, we pretty much were able to get consensus. As for the process itself, we were doing all this, new people, not in terms of being native to the area, but new in terms of the tasking before us. And we were restricted to digital Zoom type meetings. We were not going to be able to meet in person, and that was fine, but we needed to resolve our methodology so we could accomplish what was needed. And what we decided is that we would work using Google Drive as our basis for preparation and comment and what have you, inputs and reviews. And so the documents were prepared in a format looking, what's on the screen there is one of our early formats, where we identified the team lead who really was interested in getting this further. You'll notice the recommendations are there as drafts and a background section in keeping with our desire to ensure that we had data and science as the reason for moving on a particular topic. Those two were essential inputs at this point. And then throughout the entire process, we had a data references section, which would just be updated on a continuous basis. And questions or comments were posted digitally by the team. And then those comments and the documentation itself, the narrative, was resolved online or discussed during meetings if we had to resolve any issues. So that is the procedure. And by the way, we met roughly every 2 weeks. There was some discussion on maybe can we do this, on a monthly basis. We decided, and that was insufficient time because of the digital nature and because the group had a requested time life factor of 4 to 6 months, which I'm sorry to say we missed by 1 month or 1 day apparently. We're just about precisely 6 months after the start date or formation date of the WRTG. So again, how did we move? Well, approvals were discussed during meetings and online. Ultimately, when we got to a decision on the number of topics and what those topics were, and then we refined them with all the comments, and we got expert responses from our list of consultants. We then cleaned them up, put them online, and asked for everybody to review them. And we documented that review in a spreadsheet so that we knew at least if we had approval from the entire team. And for the most part, we did. There were some abstentions on some issues, but majority was an approval of the list of topics and the recommendations. Now, you might wonder why we have this opinions that didn't elevate to a recommendation factor here. And it's two reasons. One is just that if there was a comment that really couldn't be formulated into an actionable recommendation, but it was worthy to note that somebody had a concern or somebody wanted to consider expansion of a recommendation, we wanted to give that member and you folks reviewing the document the chance to see alternate opinions that might be not in conflict at all necessarily, but additive in consideration for what should proceed from this point going forward. And so we had, and in our appendix section of the report, you will see this member advisor comments section, and I advise everybody to review that because there are comments that might influence your thinking, but it also allowed us to go forward with the recommendations in their totality because nobody felt like their voice was not heard. So that's the structure and the methodology. One of the other things that sort of evolved rather naturally, when we looked at 13 topics, it turned out that it could be categorized into three categories. And we're calling this one information and data enhancement. But one of the things you should look at or consider in these is not only the title or the meaning of the recommendations, but the fact that these Category A requirements pretty much had a basis already in existence. There were agencies, and I'm going to use maybe groundwater as an example, not for any other reason other than an example. SQUIM has done a lot of work, and has done a lot of work having the groundwater monitoring and characterization work that's been done. Well, that meant that there is, number one, an existing set of data, existing reports. There is an agency that should be concerned about it. And so topics of this category have a basis for moving forward. Characterization of the fourth aquifer, not been accomplished yet, but people have talked about it. They've recognized the need for it. So the agencies, and again, the impetus has been identified. And so these are our efforts, Category A, that could be implemented fairly quickly based on local resources, and local being at the county, perhaps state level. Second category, a little bit different. And you'll remember back in our mission statement, we were asked to look at the tools and the models and see what needed to be updated. Well, Category B is just that. Characterization of the fourth aquifer, while we could start that and understand the essential elements right away or quickly, the actual characterization is going to take considerable agency interaction. Probably not just state, but federal. And federal, for no other reason, and guess who's got most of the resources that are going to be needed? It's Uncle Sam. So this category are models. They are complex. They require a lot of expert interaction. They require a lot of interagency work. And so this category was created to recognize the fact that even if you wanted to start one of these quickly, and you could start it quickly, you could initiate the action, it's likely to require a lot more complex effort and interaction of agencies before you could accomplish them. The last category, C, is just that, general interest. And this is because this category, we identified activities like the climate research on impacts to fish. That's been started by Point No Point. And there's a report on it, but it's an initial effort. They're going to continue it. They're looking for help and resources and in fact, direction. But the effort itself is very, very early in its stages. And community outreach, community support, if needed, and I'm sure there are agencies or people who would step in and do that immediately. But again, it's going to require planning, but not interagency support, or even, for that matter, a great deal of financial resources. Other things like saltwater intrusion, which Carol Creasy has sponsored. This is the kind of effort which is of importance. Every topic we arrived at, all 13, we think are important. But this one affects the least number of people in the shorter time period. But by God, it should be started. We should begin to plan and factor in how we're going to conduct these types of studies. And so they're not immediate in the sense of category A, where they could affect primary infrastructures and factors which climate change will affect going forward, but they need to be started. And future water sourcing, for instance, we have a reservoir project underway. It's been 7+ years from planning to reality. Well, it wouldn't be a bad effort to think many years ahead and start future water sourcing studies. And that's why this category, those topics were included in this category. I'm going to go through all 13 in a very summary fashion. Updated groundwater. Well, basically, there is or have been efforts for monitoring groundwater. We believe as a group that those efforts need to be expanded, and the methodologies for expanding them need to be looked at. Perhaps automated water levels in wells, other techniques. So that is one of the recommendations. The other thing we considered important was the interrelationship of sources. How does groundwater and stream flow interact? How does groundwater and recharge and stream flow interact? We know they're there. There are efforts underway, but a focused effort on determining from a scientific standpoint those interrelationships is necessary. And this third one was something that really should be considered. Groundwater quality is going to become increasingly important, but the effort itself needs to be undertaken and planned. The online expanded programs, let's create an information base and make it accessible to people who want or should be concerned about the future of their water supplies. There's a lot of information. There is information, for instance, on new water installations where the amount of usage is profiled and maintained. But gathering that data, putting it into a database that's useful, that is not an effort that's ongoing. Graphical interfaces, almost everything we talked about was how do you make this accessible and easy to understand for people? So that's what 6.2 was all about. 6.3, there is a fourth aquifer. It is a deep aquifer in our area of interest. There is test wells in place. And what we're saying is, for sure, let's start with the available data and look at the data and make sure it's solidly based. But then let's also expand our understanding of that aquifer. How far does it extend? Where is it? How is it sourced? Because we don't really understand that to the extent it should be known. And then is determine the impacts on all the aquifers as we extract water from it. What's the time factor involved in interaction or interrelationships between 3 aquifers and a deep fourth aquifer? The confining layers for that aquifer are very complex. That's very evident from the data itself. And what is the permeability of those layers? Is it consistent on the entire geological relationship or not? And then finally, this is an interesting one, the source age of the water. In other words, how often or how long does it take for fresh water to find its way into that fourth aquifer? Water demand, pretty straightforward. Again, the usage data is already being collected in some instances, but it's not being done on a deliberate basis that can provide a long-term database for this information. We think it ought to be there. We also want to take a look at, or suggest that someone take a look at, the projections themselves. The growth projections for the county, which are then put demand on the water usage. Are they 10% accurate? Are they 70% accurate? Is the basis for their predictions valid going forward? From that, generate some new analysis to project future requirements. Again, research on fish, I pointed to the fact that there is an effort in that last heat wave last year. There was considerable attempts to get scientific data on impacts on both shellfish and surface water heating. That's likely to occur more often. And the efforts are there. We think they ought to be codified to an extent where they're planned and funded. And should we consider additional impacts on birds, et cetera? So that's what that topic's all about. Community outreach is pretty easy. I think everybody has an opinion on how, who, what it requires. We're suggesting that we take the time, because it's not critical that it be done yesterday. Plan it and coordinate the efforts on how you would do outreach. If you had a condition where you had to retrench and cut down on either ag water or domestic water use, how would you reach out to people? How would you notify them? And so updated media availability of some form, bring it into current age, digital age. We're also talking about adding a fundamental outreach to the school curriculums. Let's start by educating our kids as they go through and grow and graduate, to make them aware of good and bad, what's going on, and what their individual actions, how they impact everything going forward. An interactive hydrologic map, very again, a model that needs to be enhanced or developed, allowing us to continuously input data that's gathered, hopefully automatically or at least semi-automatically, to give everyone an ability to reach out and see the conditions that are actually present. And well monitoring would be on the same tool. If in fact part of the effort was to document well monitoring, put that data online so that everybody has access to it. Integrated forecasting model, if you're aware of the fact that the National Ocean Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, is doing some fabulous work these days, because they're reaching out not only to themselves, which they have many tools available, but they're reaching out and using military satellites and data to actually do things like measure snowpack from space. That can be done. You can get the density of water from space. You can get a lot of things. And that's being done. It's not being focused. And because we have such a dependency on precipitation, we're suggesting that this tool could be useful to us. Saltwater intrusion, I've already mentioned it. one of the things that's been suggested is it's relatively modest effort to measure things like chloride, salinity, and levels of those wells that are close to salt water, and understand and access the vulnerable wells and septic systems. Again, the immediate urgency may not be there, but let's get the planning and get it started so when it does become an issue, if it becomes an issue, we're prepared. Expanded snowpack. Without a doubt, snowpack plays a major role in our water supplies. And I appreciate the conversation Ben initiated on measuring stream flow in the Dungeness. It's clear that the snow that has fallen late this year has contributed to our stream flow. It'd be really good to get a really enhanced measurement capability and also the ability to relate snow melt over time. If it disappears really fast because of local climate changes, we ought to be able to predict the impact on stream flow and not just react to it. And how does that relate to future projections for aquifer recharge? Same factors. I mean, it all comes down to the availability of water, regardless of the source, and how do you plan for its effective use? And finally, it would be wonderful to give all the water resource managers a tool that they can just click and say, okay, if we're really in for another hot week of stagnant air or super hot air, how is this likely to affect our water? Mitigating the use of the potential use of the fourth aquifer. All of our aquifers are now under consideration for recharge. And in this case, PUD and the county have in fact that meeting, and will make available the resource planning that has been done to upgrade the current mitigation calculator. There is a concern that the mitigation calculator that's good for the upper aquifers may or may not be as useful, and so it's been modified somewhat, and it may be adequate. Certainly, many agencies feel it is, and they may be right, but this is going to become a significant requirement in the future, and all the committee or team has said is, let's review it, consider it, make sure it's adequate, and update the model based on the uncertainty analysis, which is what is currently been projected as the basis for that mitigating that fourth aquifer. Shallow aquifer recharge, pretty much a different approach to than the previous slide. In this case, we've had aquifer recharge in place. There is a mitigation process. There is a tools. There are methods by which we recharge. But what is lacking in that effort is an analysis of how well the projections and the realities mesh. And so basically what this topic suggests is that that effectiveness needs to be measured and known. Future water sourcing, I'm not going to spend any time on this. It's just that. What about planning for the future? What if you had to ship water out or in for a temporary period of time? It would be good just to be able to address the issues, determine what is significant and what can be done. And that's all this topic addresses or alludes to. Okay, we're down to 2 slides, folks. In the appendix, you will see additional details that are not included in what I just went through. You'll see that there's a resource team identified on each topic. And what this is, we decided to solicit from our small team, WRTG team, those folks who would be interested in pursuing a topic, and that pursuing the topic is not defined, It could be nothing more than people having an interest in making sure that the responsible agencies pay attention or recognize it as a priority. It could be that somebody could contribute to the topic or the requirements of implementing it. So we've identified those members who more or less volunteered to work or be available as a resource, but we only had 11 members and not everybody is committed as a priority to every topic, but we wanted to put it out to the DRMT and hopefully eventually to the public and say, perhaps we need to build some interest in pursuing these individual topics. So the recommendations, they are pretty much as listed in the summary document. You may find somewhat expansive recommendations in the appendix, but I think they'll be identical for 99% of the time. Background, if you're interested in why we chose those background, you will definitely be able to find extensive descriptions of the background narrative and the comments. And I said earlier, I really suggest that you read those comments because they're cogent, they're substantive in some cases. In some cases, they're at least going to create some individual thinking. And finally, references. I think one of the outputs that really surprised myself was the amount of work that's been done. It's all there as the team members knew it was available. I think there's a second part to this. I was interested in reading some of them, but take a hard look at the dates because some of them are very, very old, very dated, more than 10, 15, 20 years. One case, maybe more decades. And I think that is useful to understand why the team feels we need to update everything. Finally, next steps. Well, fundamentally, today we're presenting this, and hopefully you've read at least the summary and some of the appendix information that you're interested in. What we need from the DRMT is an endorsement that we can accept this report in its totality or not, if that's in fact what the team decides or what the DRMT decides. Then we would look to get further guidance from the DRMT Executive Committee on what to do with the report. We want to gather and really want to ask that we, once everything is available to be published or distributed, an effort made to staff the resource teams. And then finally, how do you move on implementing these recommendations? And that's a decision to be taken. So with that, I'm pretty much at the end of the presentation.